Tonight, we step backward through the heavy, velvet curtains of time, leaving the modern world behind to gaze upon an era defined by unmatched, monumental grandeur and deep, unsettling shadows. Welcome back to Bedtime History. Take a moment to get comfortable, settle into your space, and let the exhausting burdens of the day completely drift away. We are about to embark together on an epic, sweeping chronicle of an empire so extraordinarily immense that it completely shattered and reshaped the physical, cultural, and political geography of our modern planet. This is the definitive, deeply immersive, multi-part narrative of the Spanish Empire, reimagined in a premium, cinematic style designed specifically for an American audience that appreciates the vast, complex, and high-stakes theater of human history. Long before there was ever a global, unified superpower known to the world as Spain, there existed only a fractured, sun-drenched, and blood-soaked peninsula on the westernmost edge of the known European continent. The Iberian Peninsula, that massive, rugged thumb of territory jutting defiantly into the cold, unpredictable currents of the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, was not a singular nation with a unified identity. Instead, it was a chaotic, bleeding, and constantly shifting patchwork of rival kingdoms, unstable borders, and deeply entrenched cultural enmities. For nearly 800 consecutive years, this unforgiving land served as a perpetual war zone, a brutal crucible of continuous conflict that slowly and painfully shaped the very DNA, psychology, and culture of the people who inhabited it. To truly understand the rise of this global titan, we must look back to the early decades of the 8th century, specifically to the monumental and cataclysmic year of 711. It was during this pivotal moment in human history that Islamic forces, known to Western history as the Moors, crossed the narrow, treacherous straits from North Africa. They swept across the Iberian landscape with astonishing, terrifying speed, utilizing highly sophisticated military tactics, swift cavalry maneuvers, and strategic brilliance that caught the fractured local Visigothic rulers completely off guard. Within a remarkably short period, they pushed the surviving Christian redoubts far into the rain-swept, jagged northern mountain ranges of Asturias, establishing an Islamic caliphate known as Al-Andalus, which would rapidly become the absolute cultural, scientific, and intellectual envy of the medieval world. While the absolute remainder of Western Europe was deeply mired in the exhausting agrarian struggles of the Dark Ages, trying desperately to survive famine and keep primitive thatched roofs from collapsing, the Moorish capital of Cordoba blossomed into a breathtaking, near-mythical metropolis. It was a city adorned with sprawling libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, advanced philosophers, running water, beautifully paved and illuminated streets, and an unprecedented level of religious tolerance. In this vibrant urban environment, a complex cross-cultural exchange took place between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, even as the distant, rhythmic drumbeats of war echoed persistently along the shifting northern frontiers. The long centuries that followed this initial Islamic expansion became fundamentally defined by an agonizingly slow, grinding, and deeply irregular historical process that Spaniards would later romanticize as the Reconquista, the multi-generational, holy reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by Christian forces. This was by no means a clean, continuous, or neatly organized military campaign directed by a single mind. Rather, it was an unpredictable, multi-century tide that advanced and retreated across arid, dusty plateaus and rocky, unforgiving sierras. It was a complex, Machiavellian dance of shifting alliances, broken treaties, and sudden, bloody betrayals. Christian kingdoms like Castile, Aragon, Leon, and Navarre frequently spent far more time, energy, and resources fighting one another for domestic dominance than they did combating the Islamic taifas of the south. The Moors themselves were rarely a completely unified force either, frequently fracturing into independent principalities that engaged in bitter, internecine warfare. These rival Islamic states would occasionally go so far as to hire battle-hardened Christian mercenaries to slaughter their own Muslim rivals. In this incredibly fluid, dangerous, and highly weaponized frontier world, legendary figures were forged in the fires of border raids. None became more iconic than Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the bold and brilliant Castilian nobleman immortalized by both sides as El Cid, a legendary mercenary leader who came to perfectly embody the complex, heavily militarized frontier culture of medieval Iberia. By the dawn of the late 15th century, this relentless engine of holy war had been grinding forward for over 7 centuries, steadily and inexorably pushing the boundaries of Islamic rule down into the beautiful, mountainous southeastern pocket of Granada. This was the last remaining Moorish stronghold on the peninsula, a jewel protected by steep cliffs and massive fortifications. Granada had managed to survive for generations through a sophisticated, delicate combination of strategic tribute payments, masterful diplomatic maneuvering, and the simple fact that the Christian kingdoms were too deeply divided among themselves to gather the massive, unified force necessary to breach its formidable redoubts. However, that structural political reality changed forever in the cold October of 1469. In a historic turning point, a 17-year-old princess named Isabella of Castile married an 18-year-old Aragonese prince named Ferdinand. This was no romantic match arranged at leisure. It was a high-stakes, incredibly dangerous political operation conducted in the deepest secrecy, because Isabella's half-brother, King Henry IV of Castile, had actively forbidden the union. Ferdinand had to disguise himself as a humble traveling merchant servant just to slip across the heavily guarded border into Castilian territory without being intercepted and imprisoned by hostile royal guards. They were wed in a small, tense ceremony in Valladolid, an event that possessed a fragile, improvised quality that their later, monolithic historical reputation often obscures. Yet, what these two young, fiercely ambitious, and deeply calculating monarchs built out of that secret alliance was anything but temporary. Isabella claimed the crown of Castile in 1474 following a brutal, disputed civil war of succession that threatened to tear the kingdom apart, while Ferdinand ascended to the throne of Aragon in 1479. The two crowns did not formally merge into a single administrative state. Castile and Aragon stubbornly maintained their separate laws, distinct languages, independent currencies, and separate borders. But they were now governed by a singular, relentlessly focused power couple who possessed a terrifyingly clear, unified vision for the future of their land. What Isabella and Ferdinand desired above all else was absolute, unshakable internal unity, and they chose to define that unity through the uncompromising, militant lens of strict Catholicism. In 1478, they established the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, a powerful church court backed by the full, coercive machinery of the royal state. While popular modern imagination has inflated the numbers of its physical executions, the true terror of the Spanish Inquisition lay not in raw numbers, but in its psychological efficiency. It constructed a ubiquitous, suffocating culture of religious conformity, enforced through systemic surveillance, anonymous accusations, and the constant threat of public humiliation and financial ruin. Then, in the momentous, world-altering year of 1492, the final piece of their domestic puzzle locked into place. In January of that year, after a grueling 10-year siege campaign, the Moorish Sultan Muhammad Exide, known to the west as Boabdil, rode out of the magnificent Alhambra Palace and handed the keys of the city to the Catholic monarchs. The Reconquista was over. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the entire Iberian Peninsula was under a single, triumphant Christian authority. Pope Alexander VI formally bestowed upon Isabella and Ferdinand the prestigious title of Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, a designation they wore with immense, prideful satisfaction. Yet, the fanatical energy, the heavily armed military orders, and the aggressive frontier culture that had been meticulously refined over 8 centuries could not simply be turned off or decommissioned. This highly weaponized, volatile societal machine needed a new outlet, a new frontier to conquer, and that outlet arrived just 3 months later when Queen Isabella signed a historic, risky contract with a visionary, deeply eccentric Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus. The crucible of the peninsula was about to overflow, pouring its fierce, unyielding energy across the vast expanse of the dark Atlantic Ocean. The popular, deeply generalized history of Christopher Columbus's historic voyage of 1492 is often sanitized in modern textbooks into a simplistic, almost childlike fairy tale of a solitary, visionary genius overcoming the flat earth ignorance of medieval skeptics. However, the true historical reality hidden behind the myth is far more compelling, gritty, human, and saturated with political intrigue. Christopher Columbus was an extraordinarily difficult, intensely stubborn, arrogant, and deeply religious man. A complex character who spent years hawking a fundamentally flawed, mathematically broken maritime proposal to various royal courts across Western Europe, meeting with repeated rejection, intellectual ridicule, and political closed doors. To understand the sheer desperation of his gamble, one must understand that he was not a Spanish hero, but a Genoese outsider operating in a world where foreign navigators were viewed with deep systemic suspicion. His first and most logical choice for royal sponsorship had not been Spain at all, but rather the neighboring kingdom of Portugal. In the late 15th century, Portugal was the undisputed, absolute global leader of European maritime exploration, navigation, and cartography. Under the visionary, long-term institutional legacy of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors had spent consecutive decades methodically, dangerously mapping the treacherous western coast of Africa. They were learning the highly complex, shifting wind patterns of the open Atlantic Ocean, inventing the caravel, and building a vast, fiercely guarded state repository of nautical knowledge. By the momentous year of 1488, the intrepid and legendary Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias had successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southernmost, storm-battered tip of the African continent. This monumental achievement proved conclusively to the Portuguese crown that a fabulously wealthy, direct sea route to India and the lucrative spice markets of Asia was entirely within their grasp by sailing east across the Indian Ocean. Therefore, when Christopher Columbus casually arrived in the royal court of Lisbon with his radical, highly unconventional theory that Asia could be reached much faster, cheaper, and more safely by sailing directly west into the vast, unknown, and terrifying expanse of the open Atlantic Ocean, the highly sophisticated geographers, mathematicians, and royal advisors of King John II looked at his presentation, charts, and flatly, decisively rejected them. The Portuguese rejection of Columbus was absolutely not born of superstitious, medieval ignorance or a primitive fear of falling off the edge of a flat earth. On the very contrary, it was born of vastly superior, highly accurate scientific and geographical knowledge. Columbus's entire, passionate proposal rested upon a wildly optimistic, deeply inaccurate, and fundamentally incompetent miscalculation of the Earth's true circumference. He had assembled a highly selective, biased reading of ancient biblical texts, the travel logs of Marco Polo, Islamic geographical measurements, and the encouraging but speculative letters of the Florentine cosmographer Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli. Columbus confidently estimated that the physical ocean distance from the Canary Islands to the incredibly wealthy ports of Japan was a mere 2,400 nautical miles. In stark, unyielding reality, the true distance is closer to 12,500 nautical miles. The Portuguese Royal Scientific Commission correctly pointed out that the planet was vastly larger than Columbus believed, and that any wooden fleet attempting to cross such an immense, empty, and endless expanse of open water would inevitably starve, run out of fresh water, and rot long before ever making landfall on the Asian mainland. Undeterred by this accurate scientific refutation and driven by what he believed was a divine prophetic mission, Columbus packed his charts and his flawed arithmetic, turning his attention toward the newly unified court of Spain in the year 1486. Queen Isabella was immensely intrigued by the staggering potential rewards of the venture, but she too was a highly cautious ruler. She convened her own high-level royal commission of scholars, astronomers, and theologians, known as the Talavera Commission, to thoroughly, brutally vet Columbus's radical plan. This committee spent 4 long, agonizing years debating the proposal, questioning Columbus repeatedly, before ultimately delivering the exact same intellectual verdict as the Portuguese. The mathematical distances were simply too vast, the calculations were completely unreliable, and the entire venture was a foolish, suicidal gamble that would waste royal funds. Yet, Spain's unique, highly volatile geopolitical position at that exact moment caused its historical trajectory to diverge sharply and dramatically from that of Portugal. Portugal already had its golden ticket to Asia via the African route. Spain had absolutely nothing but an expensive domestic war just drawing to a close. Columbus stubbornly remained at the Spanish court for years, living as a persistent, highly visible, and increasingly desperate figure who possessed a rare, undeniable talent for finding influential, deeply sympathetic patrons within the royal financial bureaucracy. When the commission's final negative verdict threatened to ruin his lifelong dreams forever, Luis de Santangel, a brilliant, highly pragmatic financial official in the Aragonese court, went directly to Queen Isabella to make a final, decisive intervention. Santangel masterfully, brilliantly argued that the actual financial risk of the gamble was remarkably low compared to the staggering, world-altering wealth and spiritual empire Spain stood to gain if Columbus happened to be right by some miraculous twist of fate. The funds required to launch the expedition were surprisingly modest. The venture would not even require dipping directly into the royal treasury, but would instead be financed through a clever combination of private investments, Italian merchant loans, and a forced financial loan levied on the maritime port town of Palos de la Frontera as a punishment for a past municipal infraction. For a kingdom that had just spent immense, staggering fortunes financing the final decade-long war against the Moorish stronghold of Granada, the cost of equipping 3 small, modest ships was a mere drop in the vast ocean. What Spain desperately, single-mindedly lusted after was an independent, sovereign route to the legendary spice markets, silk factories, and gemstone mines of Asia. They needed a route that was completely free from Portuguese naval interference and entirely liberated from the exorbitant, crushing taxes imposed by the expanding Ottoman Empire, which had consolidated absolute, ironclad control over the traditional overland Silk Road routes of the Middle East. If Columbus failed, Spain lost a negligible amount of money. If he succeeded, Spain would instantly bypass its rivals and become the wealthiest crown in Christendom. In the fateful April of 1492, the Catholic monarchs finally capitulated to his persistent demands, signing the historic and legally profound document known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe. The contract that Columbus managed to extract from the desperate, ambitious crown was extraordinarily, almost absurdly generous. It granted him and his direct descendants the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the immensely powerful positions of Viceroy and Governor-General over any and all islands or mainlands he discovered, and a staggering, guaranteed 10% of all raw gold, silver, gemstones, spices, and merchandise generated from those territories in perpetuity. With this heavy legal mandate in his possession, 3 small ships were quickly readied at the Andalusian port of Palos, the Santa Maria, a somewhat slow, heavy merchant cargo ship that served as his formal flagship, and the Niña and the Pinta, 2 smaller, extraordinarily agile, and versatile caravels. These caravels featured the shallow drafts and versatile lateen rigging that represented the absolute cutting edge of late medieval European maritime engineering. Contrary to popular historical myth, the crews, numbering roughly 90 men, were not desperate convicts or murderers dragged from dark royal dungeons. Instead, they were experienced, highly capable, and fiercely professional local mariners from the region, men who knew the dangerous currents of the Atlantic intimately and were led by the brilliant, wealthy Pinzon brothers. On the historic morning of August 3rd, 1492, this modest, fragile flotilla weighed anchor and glided out into the open ocean, stopping briefly at the Canary Islands to completely overhaul their rigging and take on vital supplies before turning their bows resolutely westward into an uncharted, terrifying expanse of blue water where no European fleet had ever intentionally sailed. For 33 agonizingly long days, the 3 small Spanish vessels, the Santa Maria, the Niña, and the Pinta, drove deeper and deeper into the vast, featureless, and seemingly endless blue desert of the open Atlantic Ocean. They were carried smoothly but terrifyingly by the steady, unyielding, and irreversible embrace of the easterly trade winds. While the weather during the crossing remained remarkably calm, almost suspiciously peaceful, the psychological toll on the isolated crew grew heavier and more suffocating with each passing league. They were moving further away from the known, comfortable boundaries of the European world than any human beings before them, venturing into a blank space on the map where popular medieval lore predicted sea monsters, boiling waters, and the literal edge of the physical world. The endless horizon, day after day showing nothing but water and sky, began to slowly unravel the sanity of the crew. To prevent absolute panic, hysteria, and an inevitable violent mutiny among his men, Christopher Columbus famously engaged in a calculated, meticulous piece of psychological manipulation. He chose to keep two entirely separate logbooks, one private, containing the true, immense distances covered each day, and a second, falsified logbook featuring significantly smaller numbers that he openly shared with his frightened officers and sailors to maintain their fragile, cracking morale, making them believe they were still within a safe rescue distance from the Canary Islands. Tension reached a dangerous, explosive boiling point in the early, tense weeks of October. The sailors were deeply, existentially unnerved by strange, inexplicable magnetic compass variations that baffled their experienced pilots, and the sudden appearance of the endless, weed-choked horizons of the Sargasso Sea, which made them fear their wooden ships would become permanently trapped and stranded in a green desert of vegetation until they starved to death. Secret meetings were being held below deck, knives were sharpened, and talk of throwing the stubborn Genoese admiral overboard grew louder by the hour. Finally, in the pitch-black, dark pre-dawn hours of October 12th, 1492, under a brilliant canopy of unfamiliar stars, a sharp-eyed, desperate lookout aboard the racing caravel Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana caught the faint, white gleam of moonlit limestone cliffs rising proudly on the distant horizon. Landfall, against all scientific probability, had been achieved. As the sun rose over a brilliant turquoise sea, Christopher Columbus, clothed in rich velvet and heavy steel armor, stepped ashore on a small, lush coral island in the Bahamas, which he promptly claimed for the distant crown of Castile, naming it San Salvador. The local people who watched from the shadows of the palms as these strange, heavily bearded, armor-clad, and metallic men stumbled onto their white beaches were the Taino, the peaceful indigenous inhabitants of the Lucayan archipelago and the Greater Antilles. They were absolutely not the primitive, unthinking savages that early, self-serving European colonial narratives would persistently and systematically depict. Rather, the Taino were a highly organized, deeply spiritual, and sophisticated agrarian society living in structured, clean villages governed by hereditary chiefs known as caciques. They had developed complex, long-distance trade networks across the Caribbean Sea using massive dugout canoes, cultivated extensive, highly productive agricultural fields of cassava, sweet potatoes, and maize, and possessed a rich, beautiful worldview. Columbus, however, was completely incapable of seeing them as equal human beings. He viewed them entirely and exclusively through the cold, pragmatic lens of European imperial calculation and resource extraction. In his very first journal entries, written on the evening of discovery, he noted with chilling precision their physical beauty, their gentle demeanor, their absolute lack of iron weaponry, and their generous nature, concluding with terrifying, historic pragmatism that they were incredibly cooperative, easily controlled, and would make excellent, compliant servants. His sharp eyes, however, were instantly and single-mindedly drawn away from the people and toward the small, delicate, and hammered gold ornaments that many of the Taino wore through their noses and ears. Through crude, frustrated sign language and aggressive gestures, Columbus demanded to know the exact geographic source of this precious, gleaming metal. The cooperative Taino, wanting only to please these strange, unpredictable visitors, pointed vaguely toward the larger, mountainous islands rising out of the south and west. Completely blinded by his inaccurate geography and his absolute refusal to admit his mathematical errors, Columbus remained utterly convinced until his dying breath that he had successfully bypassed the outer fringes of India and reached the wealthy, civilized realms of Japan and the Great Khan. Sailing deeper into the warm, labyrinthine waters of the Caribbean, Columbus mapped the sweeping, dense coasts of Cuba and a massive, mountainous island he named La Isla Española Hispaniola. On the silent, tragic Christmas Eve of 1492, absolute disaster struck the expedition when the slow flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground on a treacherous, hidden coral reef off the northern coast of Hispaniola, its wooden hull breached beyond any hope of repair. Exhibiting his characteristic resourcefulness and opportunism, Columbus salvaged the heavy timber from the wrecked flagship to construct a small, fortified settlement named La Navidad, the very first European imperial outpost established in the Americas. He left 39 men behind, drawn from the crew, with strict, absolute instructions to maintain peaceful, respectful relations with the local cacique, Guacanagari, who had generously aided the Spaniards in salvaging their waterlogged cargo, and to focus every ounce of their energy entirely on locating and accumulating gold mines. Columbus then sailed triumphantly back to Spain aboard the tiny, crowded Niña, carrying a modest collection of gold trinkets, exotic parrots, unfamiliar agricultural plants, and several captured, terrified Taino captives. His return to Europe was a masterpiece of orchestrated public theater and royal propaganda. He printed a highly sensationalized, romanticized letter detailing his discoveries that quickly circulated across a stunned, envious European continent. When he finally met Isabella and Ferdinand in Barcelona, they received him with full, unprecedented royal honors, confirming his grand titles and immediately financing a second, massive expedition designed not for peaceful exploration, but for permanent, aggressive, and total colonization. When Columbus returned to the shores of Hispaniola in late 1493, it was not with 3 small ships, but at the head of a massive, imposing imperial armada of 17 ships carrying over 1,200 soldiers, eager priests, desperate artisans, and cold royal bureaucrats. Upon arriving at the site of La Navidad, however, he found the settlement completely burned to ash, and the bloated, rotting corpses of all 39 of his men scattered in the coastal brush. The Spanish garrison had quickly, completely abandoned their strict instructions. They had fractured into armed, predatory bands that roamed the island, brutally demanding gold, destroying villages, and raping Taino women until the local populations, pushed beyond human endurance, finally rose up under their caciques and systematically exterminated the abusers. The initial, fragile illusion of a peaceful, tropical Eden vanished instantly in the smoke of La Navidad. Columbus established a new colonial capital named La Isabela, which quickly deteriorated into a miserable, disease-ridden, and deeply rebellious outpost filled with desperate European men furious that gold could not be picked up easily from the dirt. To satisfy the crushing, relentless financial demands of the royal crown and his private Italian investors, Columbus instituted a brutal, systemic tribute system across the entire island of Hispaniola. Every single indigenous adult over the age of 14 was legally required to deliver a fixed, heavy quota of gold dust every 3 months. Those who successfully brought their tribute were given a stamped copper token to wear proudly around their necks, while those who failed to meet the quota had their hands brutally, systematically amputated by Spanish swords, leaving them to bleed to death in the dirt as a horrific visual warning to others. This was the horrific, mechanical beginning of a demographic ruin that, combined with the arrival of devastating Old World diseases, would completely erase the Taino population from the face of the earth within a single century. The historical term conquistador almost instantly evokes stylized, highly romanticized images of monolithic, professional state soldiers clad in gleaming, polished Milanese steel armor, marching through dense, emerald-green tropical jungles with an unstoppable, near-mechanical military purpose. However, the raw, unvarnished human reality of these men was vastly more desperate, socially complex, predatory, and economically volatile than any modern military myth suggests. The overwhelming, vast majority of the men who crossed the terrifying expanse of the Atlantic Ocean in the early decades of the 16th century were absolutely not wealthy aristocrats, nor were they official, salaried soldiers of a professional royal army dispatched by the king. Instead, they were a deeply desperate, aggressively ambitious, and heavily weaponized underclass of young men pulled directly from the hard, impoverished, and forgotten margins of Spanish feudal society. The highly rigid Spanish social hierarchy of the 16th century possessed a very specific, deeply problematic socio-legal category for individuals like them: the hidalgo. These were minor noblemen who legally possessed a recognized family name and a proud, stubborn claim to gentility, but who held absolutely no land, no inherited family wealth, and no reliable economic income to support their inflated aristocratic pride. The very word itself is a telling, profoundly revealing linguistic contraction of the Spanish phrase hijo de algo, which translates literally and precisely to the son of someone. In a newly unified Iberia that had suddenly, awkwardly found itself at peace after 8 long centuries of internal religious warfare, an immense, displaced generation of young men trained exclusively and single-mindedly in the dark arts of violence, siege, warfare, and cattle raiding found themselves with 0 economic prospects, 0 agricultural interest, and 0 industrial future at home. They looked across the massive, churning waters of the Atlantic toward the rapidly shifting, chaotic frontier of the Caribbean, not out of romantic curiosity or scientific wonder, but out of absolute, raw material necessity. It was a high-stakes, lethal global lottery where they could actively gamble their fragile lives against the ultimate, glittering prizes of vast land ownership, permanent indigenous labor forces, and hereditary titles of nobility. A stunningly, almost layout-altering disproportionate number of the most famous, brutal, and politically successful conquistadors came from a single, specific, and incredibly harsh geographical region of western Spain, the remote province of Extremadura. This dry, rocky, intensely hot, and wine-swept landscape was legendary for producing tough, uncompromising, and deeply ruthless individuals, primarily because the thin soil was utterly incapable of supporting its human population through traditional agriculture or farming. Men like Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, Hernando de Soto, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, and Pedro de Valdivia were all literal and metaphorical sons of this hard, unforgiving Extremaduran earth. They grew up completely saturated with the aggressive, militant assumptions of the recently concluded Reconquista, the deep cultural belief that territorial property belonged exclusively to those strong enough to seize it by the edge of a steel sword, that the Catholic Church would actively and divinely bless the violent dispossession and subjugation of non-believers, and that supreme, life-altering wealth belonged naturally to those bold enough to grasp it through sheer military audacity. The exact financial and legal mechanism of this massive, continent-spanning conquest was governed not by state departments, but by a loose, highly formalized commercial legal framework called the capitulation. This was essentially a private joint stock contract entered into directly between an ambitious expedition leader and the royal bureaucracy of the crown. The royal treasury did not fund these dangerous voyages. Instead, the aspiring conquistador had to mortgage his entire future, raising private venture capital from wealthy Genoese merchants, civilian bankers, and local investors to personally purchase expensive wooden ships, imported horses, steel weapons, armor, gunpowder, and basic provisions. If the private expedition failed miserably, as hundreds did, the leader was utterly ruined, facing immediate debtor's prison or a lonely death in the jungle. However, if it succeeded, the royal crown claimed formal administrative ownership of the conquered territory and a guaranteed 20% of all precious metals, gemstones, and pearls discovered. The legendary, carefully tracked tax known as the quintu real, or the royal fifth. In return for this massive revenue, the conquistador leader received immense, hereditary land grants, legal governorships, and prestigious titles of nobility that would elevate his family for generations. This completely privatized, high-risk system of conquest naturally produced an intensely cutthroat, predatory, and deeply paranoid colonial culture. Conquistadors routinely viewed their fellow Spanish rivals with as much intense suspicion, jealousy, and violent hatred as they did the indigenous populations they were actively displacing. Partnerships regularly dissolved into cold-blooded, backstabbing murder, mutiny, and legal warfare the exact moment wealth or gold was finally secured on the ground. To legitimize the raw, naked, and unprovoked violence of these private corporate expeditions, sophisticated Spanish jurists in Madrid in 1513 constructed an extraordinary, mind-bending legal document known to history as the requerimiento, the requirement. Under strict royal law, a conquistador was legally required to read this lengthy, complex theological and legal text aloud to indigenous populations before commencing any military hostilities, firing a single cannon, or drawing a sword. The heavy document outlined a highly specific Christian history of the creation of the world, the absolute spiritual authority of the Pope over all nations, and the formal donation of the entire American continent to the kings of Spain by papal decree. It concluded with a stark, terrifying, and legally binding ultimatum. If the indigenous listeners peacefully accepted the absolute sovereignty of the Spanish crown and allowed the immediate, unhindered preaching of the Catholic faith, they would be received in love and charity. But if they refused or delayed out of stubbornness, the Spanish would launch a total war of extermination against them. The text openly warned that the conquistadors would enter their lands by force, destroy their villages, enslave their wives and children, and legally declare that all subsequent slaughter, ruin, and agony was entirely and exclusively the indigenous people's fault for not submitting to the legal reality. This surreal, deeply hypocritical legal theater was performed with absolute, bureaucratic regularity across the entire American continent. It was read from the wooden decks of ships to dark, silent, and empty coastlines. It was mumbled by tired scribes in Old Spanish to thick, rustling jungles, and it was occasionally barked in low whispers to sleeping indigenous villages mere moments before a devastating, bloody dawn cavalry charge ripped through the thatched huts. While enlightened, deeply horrified Spanish priests like the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas would openly mock the requerimiento as an absurd, laughably unjust mockery of Christian law and human sanity. The pragmatic conquistadors embraced it fully because it provided them with a vital piece of notarized bureaucratic paper that satisfied the meticulous legal requirements of the Spanish court. System. The Catholic Church traveled as an inseparable, deeply complicit partner with these private expeditions, providing the essential moral and theological vocabulary that transformed the brutal, bloody business of raw land theft and human exploitation into a holy, divine mission of salvation. In the landmark year of 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa beautifully and terrifyingly demonstrated exactly what this potent combination of desperate personal ambition, military force, and legal theater could achieve. Having famously fled a crushing debtor's prison in Hispaniola by stowing away inside a dirty flour barrel on a supply ship, Balboa used his charisma to seize leadership of a failing, disease-ridden settlement in Panama. Hearing tantalizing rumors from local indigenous captives of a great, wealthy sea to the south, he led a grueling, hacking expedition across the dense, malaria-ridden, and jaguar-infested jungles of the Isthmus of Panama. On the morning of September 25, 1513, Balboa climbed a prominent, isolated mountain peak and became the very first European to gaze upon the vast, blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean from the Americas. Days later, he waded directly into its breaking surf in full steel armor, holding a banner of the Virgin Mary, and claimed the entire ocean, every shore it touched, and every island within it for the distant crown of Castile. The epic and terrifying narrative of the fall of the Mexica civilization, more commonly and widely known to the modern world as the Aztec Empire, is frequently and inaccurately compressed into a simplistic, highly Eurocentric myth of absolute military supremacy. Popular culture often attributes the dramatic conquest entirely to the psychological shock of Spanish steel armor, roaring gunpowder cannons, and the tactical deployment of imposing military horses. However, the deep historical reality hidden beneath this superficial analysis reveals a far more complex, Machiavellian, and psychologically dark theater of political opportunism, deep structural indigenous fractures, and a brutal, continent-spanning civil war. The towering, complex architect of this monumental invasion was Hernán Cortés, a deeply calculating, highly educated former law student turned brilliant military strategist from the rugged town of Medellin in Extremadura. In the fateful year of 1519, operating in open, treasonous defiance of his direct superior, Governor Diego Velázquez of Cuba, Cortés gathered a private fleet of 11 ships, roughly 500 desperate Spanish infantrymen, 16 highly valuable war horses, and a small, modest detachment of artillery, setting sail directly for the unfamiliar, heavily fortified mainland of Mesoamerica. Upon making landfall on the sun-baked, humid coast of the modern Mexican state of Veracruz, Cortés was not entering a primitive, unorganized wilderness. Instead, he was stepping directly into a highly sophisticated, densely populated, and profoundly tense imperial network dominated by the triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. At the absolute apex of this massive imperial system sat the Mexica Emperor Moctezuma II, a highly contemplative, deeply religious, and militarily experienced ruler who governed a sprawling tribute empire of over 5 million subjects from his breathtaking, waterlocked capital city of Tenochtitlan. The Mexica, however, had built their immense empire through relentless, brutal military expansion, enforcing heavy, crushing tribute demands on hundreds of conquered city-states across the region. These subjects were forced to continuously surrender vast wealth in the form of raw gold, jade, textiles, agricultural produce, and human captives destined for the bloody sacrificial altars of the great temples. This created a highly volatile, deeply unstable geopolitical landscape that was literally a powder keg of native resentment, waiting for a single, external spark to ignite a total revolution. Cortés's most powerful, world-altering weapon during this opening campaign was absolutely not a steel sword or a gunpowder cannon, but rather a profound, highly sophisticated linguistic bridge that allowed him to navigate this dense web of indigenous politics with terrifying clarity. After defeating a local Maya chieftain on the Tabasco coast, the Spaniards were presented with 20 young indigenous women as a diplomatic peace offering. Among them was a remarkably intelligent, culturally astute young noblewoman named Malinche, who would enter global history under the Spanish name Doña Marina, or the controversial modern title of La Malinche. Malinche possessed the incredibly rare, highly strategic ability to speak both the coastal Chontalmaya language and Nahuatl, the official imperial language of the Aztec court. Operating in a complex linguistic chain with a shipwrecked Spanish priest named Geronimo de Aguilar, who had spent years in Maya captivity and learned their language. Malinche translated Nahuatl into Maya, and Aguilar translated Maya into Castilian Spanish. This allowed Cortés to immediately bypass the fog of war, gathering precise, high-level intelligence regarding the internal political rivalries, economic stress points, and intense military weaknesses of the Aztec Empire long before he ever marched into the interior. Recognizing her immense strategic value, Cortés quickly made Doña Marina his primary advisor, constant companion, and diplomatic interpreter. Armed with her precise geopolitical insights, Cortés made a historic, incredibly audacious decision designed to completely eliminate any possibility of retreat or cowardice among his deeply divided, terrified men. He secretly ordered the systematic dismantling and intentional beaching of his entire naval fleet at Veracruz, effectively cutting off any physical path back to Cuba and forcing his 500 conquistadors into a stark, absolute binary choice. They would either successfully conquer this massive, deeply populated empire, or they would die a bloody, agonizing death on its battlefields. With their ships transformed into rotting wood on the beach, the small Spanish force, accompanied by several hundred coastal Totonac allies who were desperate to escape the crushing thumb of Aztec tyranny, turned their faces resolutely toward the high, cold mountain passes of the Sierra Madre, marching directly toward the heart of the Valley of Mexico. As the small expedition pushed deeper into the mountainous interior, they entered the fiercely independent, heavily fortified territory of Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans were a proud, highly disciplined martial society that had stubbornly, successfully resisted Aztec military encirclement and systemic blockades for generations, preserving their freedom through sheer military grit. Initially, the Tlaxcalans viewed the strange, armor-clad white intruders with intense hostility, launching a series of massive, coordinated, and extraordinarily bloody waves of human attacks that pushed Cortés's small force to the absolute brink of total physical annihilation. The Spaniards only survived through the highly disciplined use of their steel swords, overlapping crossbow fire, and the terrifying, shock and awe deployment of their heavy cavalry units against the densely packed indigenous infantry lines. After several days of brutal, exhausting combat that inflicted heavy casualties on both sides, the wise elders of the Tlaxcalan Senate held a strategic emergency council and made a monumental, history-altering decision. They realized that these deadly, highly effective foreign newcomers could serve as the ultimate, divinely sent military hammer to completely smash their eternal, existential enemies in Tenochtitlan. The Tlaxcalans formally called a truce, opened their massive capital city to Cortés, and forged an ironclad, unyielding military alliance that would provide the Spaniards with thousands of fiercely loyal, highly experienced native warriors who knew exactly how the Aztec military operated. The terrifying potential of this European indigenous alliance was brutally, calculatedly demonstrated to the region in October of 1519 at the ancient, holy city of Cholula. Cholula was a massive, highly populated religious center home to the legendary Great Pyramid and was formally allied with the Aztec capital. Moctezuma II had sent secret imperial emissaries to Cholula, and rumors quickly reached Doña Marina through local informants that a massive, coordinated military ambush was being planned to trap and systematically slaughter the Spaniards inside the city's narrow, winding streets. Cortés responded with a calculated, preemptive act of sheer, unrestrained terror designed to send a chilling, unforgettable psychological shockwave across the entire continent. He summoned the entire noble leadership, priesthood, and unarmed military elite of Cholula into the great enclosed central courtyard of the main temple under the pretense of a peaceful diplomatic departure. Once they were securely trapped inside the high stone walls, Cortés gave a prearranged signal. Spanish soldiers drew their steel swords, blocking the exits, while their Tlaxcalan allies rushed into the courtyard from the outside. For several horrific hours, a systematic, cold-blooded slaughter occurred, leaving thousands of unarmed Cholulan nobles, priests, and citizens hacked to pieces in the dirt, while the holy city was systematically looted and burned to the ground. The horrific news of the total destruction of Cholula shattered the confidence of the imperial court in Tenochtitlan, throwing Moctezuma II into a profound state of deep psychological and political paralysis. On the historic morning of November 8th, 1519, the combined Spanish and Tlaxcalan army marched along the massive, elevated southern stone causeway that led directly across the shimmering, wide waters of Lake Texcoco and into the heart of Tenochtitlan. The conquistadors were absolutely stunned, almost completely breathless with disbelief at the sheer scale, clean geometry, and immense beauty of the metropolis that opened before their eyes. Tenochtitlan was a masterpiece of advanced engineering and urban planning, a city of over 200,000 inhabitants, which made it significantly larger, cleaner, and vastly more organized than Paris, London, or Madrid at that exact time. It featured massive, whitewashed stone temples that towered into the blue sky, clean, well-lit public plazas, beautifully constructed aqueducts supplying fresh water from the distant hills of Chapultepec, and a complex labyrinth of deep canals that functioned as busy aquatic streets filled with thousands of trading canoes. Moctezuma II, choosing a policy of deep diplomatic appeasement over immediate military resistance, walked out along the causeway to formally greet Hernán Cortés. The emperor was dressed in magnificent, flowing cotton robes, a towering headdress of iridescent green quetzal feathers, and golden sandals that prevented his feet from ever touching the bare earth. He welcomed the Spaniards as honored, highly powerful guests, escorting them directly into the vast, sprawling stone palaces of his own royal ancestors. For a brief, surreal week, a tense, fragile peace held over the city as the two entirely different civilizations stared at one another with a mixture of intense curiosity and deep, boiling suspicion. However, Cortés knew that his position inside this massive, waterlocked metropolis was incredibly precarious. He was effectively trapped inside a beautiful velvet cage, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of potentially hostile Aztec warriors who could easily destroy the causeways at a single word from their emperor and starve the small Spanish force to death. Exhibiting his characteristic audacity and absolute ruthlessness, Cortés executed a stunning political coup. He marched into Moctezuma's private royal chambers with a detachment of fully armed captains and, under the immediate, terrifying threat of steel swords, placed the absolute ruler of the Aztec Empire under formal house arrest, forcing him to govern his entire domain as a compliant, shattered puppet of the Spanish crown. The fragile, deeply unnatural political equilibrium inside the captured metropolis of Tenochtitlan could not hold indefinitely. It was an explosive, highly volatile illusion destined to shatter under the weight of mounting Spanish greed and deep, righteous indigenous fury. While Hernán Cortés successfully held the shattered Emperor Moctezuma II under strict house arrest, forcing him to act as a compliant royal puppet. A sudden and existential military threat arrived from the Caribbean coast that threatened to completely ruin Cortés's grand imperial ambitions. Governor Diego Velázquez of Cuba, absolutely furious at Cortés's blatant, treasonous defiance, had dispatched a massive, heavily armed, punitive armada consisting of 18 fully equipped ships, over 900 experienced Spanish soldiers, and a large detachment of heavy artillery under the iron command of the ruthless general Panfilo de Narvaez. Their explicit, legal royal mandate was to hunt Cortés down, arrest him for high treason, and strip him of all his stolen wealth and conquered territories. Exhibiting his characteristic, near-miraculous military audacity, Cortés refused to wait like a trapped animal inside the Aztec capital. He made the incredibly risky strategic decision to divide his dangerously small force, leaving a mere 80 Spanish soldiers under the highly unstable, volatile command of his fiery captain Pedro de Alvarado to maintain control over the captive emperor and the city. Cortés took his remaining 300 battle-hardened veterans and slipped out of Tenochtitlan in the dead of night. He marched with astonishing speed back down into the humid coastal lowlands, utilizing the thick cover of a torrential tropical thunderstorm to launch a brilliant, highly coordinated surprise midnight assault against Narvaez's heavily guarded encampment at Zempoala. Cortés's veteran troops, completely hardened by months of brutal frontier warfare, easily overwhelmed the newly arrived, inexperienced Cuban forces. Displaying his masterful grasp of human psychology and raw greed, Cortés did not execute his captured rivals. Instead, he opened heavy chests of looted Aztec gold, jade, and silver, brilliantly parading the glittering wealth before the wide, greedy eyes of the defeated soldiers. He offered them an instant, highly lucrative choice. They could either return to Cuba in poverty, or they could immediately join his grand expedition and claim their own immense fortunes in the interior. Narvaez's entire army, driven by raw material lust, instantly switched their allegiances, effectively transforming Cortés's small, desperate force into a massive imperial army of over 1,000 fully armed Spanish infantrymen and nearly 100 elite cavalry horses. However, while Cortés was achieving this spectacular, bloodless diplomatic and military triumph on the coast, absolute chaos and unmitigated horror were unraveling his fragile empire back in the Valley of Mexico. Left entirely to his own volatile devices, the deeply paranoid, intensely unstable Pedro de Alvarado grew increasingly terrified by the massive, rhythmic sound of ceremonial drums and the gathering of tens of thousands of elite Aztec warriors in the great central plaza of the city. The Mexica population had gathered peacefully to celebrate their sacred annual religious festival of Tlaxcala, an ancient ceremony honoring the great deity Huitzilopochtli. Completely blinded by raw cowardice, xenophobia, and a deeply irrational fear of an imminent, imaginary native ambush, Alvarado made a catastrophic, blood-chilling decision. He ordered his heavily armed Spanish sentries to block all the monumental stone exits of the great enclosed courtyard, trapping the unarmed, dancing Aztec nobility, high priests, and military elite inside the high stone walls. Without warning, the Spanish soldiers drew their steel swords and unleashed a systematic, cold-blooded massacre of unparalleled brutality. They hacked through the soft cotton robes, systematically decapitating dancers, piercing chests with steel pikes, and leaving the absolute cream of the Mexica aristocratic leadership butchered and bleeding in the dirt. The horrific news of the Tlaxcala massacre instantly dissolved any remaining indigenous patience or fear. The entire city of Tenochtitlan rose up as a singular, deeply enraged collective entity. The terrifying, deep roar of thousands of war whistles echoed across the lake, and within minutes, The surviving Spanish garrison found themselves violently besieged, heavily barricaded inside their stone palaces, completely surrounded by an ocean of furious, weaponized Aztec warriors who were entirely willing to die to avenge their murdered sons. When Cortés finally returned to the valley at the head of his massive, newly acquired army, he marched into a dead, eerily silent city. The markets were completely abandoned, the canals were empty, and the air was thick with the suffocating scent of burning copal incense and hidden malice. The Aztecs deliberately allowed Cortés to march his entire, massive reinforcements directly into the central palace complex, and the moment the heavy Spanish iron gates closed behind them, they slammed the velvet trap shut, launching an all-out, unrelenting assault of near unimaginable scale and violence. From the high flat roofs of the surrounding palaces, thousands of specialized Aztec slingers and archers rained a devastating, continuous black cloud of heavy stones, obsidian-tipped arrows, and flaming javelins down into the exposed central courtyard. Every single day, massive, dense human waves of highly disciplined warriors charged the Spanish walls, completely indifferent to the devastating, close-range blasts of Spanish cannons and crossbow fire that tore massive, bloody lanes through their packed ranks. The fields of dead bodies were instantly replaced by fresh, eager fighters. Recognizing that his massive army was rapidly running out of gunpowder, clean fresh water, and basic food supplies, a desperate Cortés dragged the shattered, deeply depressed Emperor Moctezuma II onto the high royal balcony of the palace, forcing him to beg his furious subjects to cease their violent attacks and allow the Spaniards to peacefully evacuate the city. The crowd, however, looked upon their former god king with nothing but profound, unadulterated disgust and betrayal. They openly shouted that he was no longer their ruler, and a sudden, violent hail of heavy stones and sharp obsidian missiles erupted from the crowd. Moctezuma was struck directly in the head by a heavy stone, collapsing onto the stone floor. He died 3 days later in deep agony and political irrelevance, his body unceremoniously dumped outside the palace walls by the Spaniards, who no longer had any practical legal use for him. With the emperor dead and the massive stone causeways systematically dismantled by the Aztec engineers, Cortés realized with absolute clarity that his entire army faced imminent, absolute starvation and total physical extermination if they remained inside the city for another 72 hours. He ordered a desperate, highly secretive midnight evacuation plan for the rainy night of June 30th, 1520, a date that would enter global history under the deeply sorrowful Spanish title of La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows. To cross the deep gaps that had been intentionally cut into the wooden causeways, Spanish carpenters constructed a temporary, highly improvised portable wooden bridge that had to be carried by hand through the mud. Before marching, Cortés opened the grand royal treasure vaults, unleashing a psychological trap upon his own greedy men. He officially permitted the conquistadors to take as much looted gold, silver, and heavy treasure as they could physically carry, while his battle-hardened veterans from Extremadura wisely took only a few light, highly valuable gemstones. The newly arrived, extraordinarily greedy soldiers from Narvaez's coastal army foolishly stuffed their pockets, their armor linings, and their heavy bags with dozens of pounds of heavy, solid gold bars, completely encumbering their physical movement. In the midst of a driving, blinding midnight rainstorm, the massive, silent column of Spanish soldiers and their remaining Tlaxcalan allies crept out of the palace gates, moving stealthily along the narrow, slick stone causeway of Tlacopan. They successfully managed to place their portable bridge across the first deep water gap, but just as the vanguard began to cross, A sharp-eyed Aztec woman fetching fresh water along the lake shore caught sight of the metallic reflection of their armor through the dark rain. Her piercing, terrifying scream erupted across the silent water. "Mexica! Come quickly!" Our enemies are escaping. Instantly, the great snakeskin war drums of the main temple began to thunder through the night, and the silent lake came alive with the terrifying sound of thousands of paddles as a massive armada of Aztec war canoes converged upon the narrow, exposed causeway from both sides. What followed was a chaotic, unmitigated slaughterhouse in the dark. The Aztecs attacked with unrelenting, highly coordinated fury, using long obsidian-tipped pikes to pull panicked Spanish cavalry horses directly off the slick stone path and into the deep, churning black water. The portable wooden bridge became permanently wedged into the mud under the immense weight of the artillery, leaving the middle and rear of the long column completely trapped, exposed, and helpless. Absolute panic ripped through the Spanish ranks. Men pushed, shoved, and trampled one another in the dark, screaming for mercy that would never come. Those greedy soldiers who had weighed themselves down with massive amounts of looted gold bars were instantly knocked into the deep water, sinking like heavy lead stones to the dark bottom of Lake Texcoco, where they drowned in agony in the mud. The deep gaps in the causeway rapidly filled to the absolute brim with a horrific, compressed mass of dead horses, overturned supply wagons, shattered cannons, and the bloody, broken corpses of hundreds of Spanish and Tlaxcalan soldiers. The surviving remnants of the vanguard only managed to escape across the lake by literally walking across this floating, gruesome bridge of human flesh and bone. Hernán Cortés himself successfully struggled to the safe mainland shore, where he sat beneath a massive, ancient cypress tree in the gray dawn, looking back at the shattered, bleeding remnants of his once proud army, and openly wept bitter tears of absolute despair for his lost men and his ruined dreams of global empire. The catastrophic retreat of La Noche Triste had left the once proud Spanish army a hollow, bleeding, and deeply traumatized remnant of its former self. Over half of Hernán Cortés's infantrymen lay dead, their broken bodies rotting in the mud of Lake Texcoco, or held in dark stone cages awaiting the obsidian sacrificial knives of the Aztec priests. Nearly every single surviving soldier was severely wounded, covered in deep gashes, and suffering from acute physical exhaustion. The vast majority of their invaluable war horses had been slaughtered. Their heavy gunpowder artillery was entirely lost to the deep waters, and their crucial stockpile of crossbow bolts and iron weapons was dangerously depleted. As this shattered column of survivors dragged themselves painfully around the northern perimeter of the valley, moving slowly toward the tentative safety of Tlaxcalan territory, the newly elevated Aztec Emperor, Cuitlahuac, a fiercely competent military leader who had orchestrated the devastating midnight assault, dispatched a massive imperial army to systematically hunt them down and eliminate them before they could ever reach the mountains. On the scorching morning of July 7th, 1520, on the wide, dust-swept plains of Otumba, the retreating Spaniards climbed a small ridge and looked down upon a sight that instantly froze the blood in their veins. Blocking their path entirely was an immense, ocean-like sea of over 40,000 elite Aztec and Triple Alliance warriors, their white quilted cotton armor gleaming brightly in the harsh sun, their massive wooden shields adorned with rich green feathers, and their long obsidian-tipped broadswords held high in a terrifying display of absolute military dominance. At the center of this massive host sat the grand Aztec war commander, Cihuaca, clad in spectacular, high-range golden armor and carrying a massive silver net banner that served as the primary, highly visible command signal for his entire army. The situation for Cortés was mathematically hopeless. His 400 limping infantrymen and mere 20 surviving horses were outnumbered nearly 100 to 1, trapped in an open valley with no physical barriers, no defensive fortifications, and zero gunpowder to balance the immense human odds. Faced with imminent, absolute extermination, Cortés executed a tactical maneuver born of pure, unadulterated desperation and brilliant military intuition. He understood that the highly disciplined Aztec military machine operated on strict hierarchical lines, moving and attacking exclusively in response to the physical movements and visual banners of their high commanders. Gathering his mere handful of surviving cavalry officers, including the relentless Pedro de Alvarado and the bold Gonzalo de Sandoval, Cortés placed his own lance at the vanguard, ordered his men to ignore the swirling mass of foot soldiers, and launched a singular, high-speed, and suicidal cavalry charge directly into the absolute thickest, most heavily guarded center of the Aztec lines. The sheer kinetic shock of 20 massive, armor-clad war horses charging at full speed shattered the packed indigenous infantry formations. Before the Aztec commanders could comprehend the audacious maneuver, Cortés and his elite riders cut a bloody path directly through the inner guard, trampling priests and nobles, until Cortés personally drove his steel lance through the body of the supreme commander, Cihuaca, while his captain Juan de Salamanca leapt from his horse to seize the great silver net banner. The moment the high commander fell and his sacred banner vanished from the sky, the immense Aztec army fell into a state of sudden, absolute psychological shock and tactical paralysis. Believing that their gods had suddenly abandoned them on the field, the 40,000 warriors broke their disciplined formations, turned away from the battle, and fled into the hills, allowing the bleeding Spaniards to miraculously escape across the border into Tlaxcala. Upon arriving back in the massive capital of Tlaxcala, the wounded conquistadors were received with immense warmth, political shelter, and advanced medical care by their fierce indigenous allies. However, the political elite of Tlaxcala stood at a monumental, history-defining crossroads. Emissaries from the new Aztec Emperor arrived in the city carrying rich gifts of fine gold, jade, and salt, proposing an immediate pan-indigenous alliance to completely exterminate the white foreign parasites and preserve Mesoamerican civilization from permanent disruption. For days, the elder statesmen of the Tlaxcalan Senate engaged in a fierce, deeply divided debate regarding their geopolitical future. The younger factions argued passionately that the Spaniards were treacherous, unpredictable conquerors who would inevitably turn on their hosts, whereas the older, highly influential senators, led by the brilliant Maxixcatzin, argued with cold pragmatism that the Aztecs were an eternal, unforgiving tyranny that would inevitably destroy Tlaxcala if they ever regained absolute domestic dominance. Ultimately, the Senate rejected the Aztec embassy and chose to double down on their ironclad military alliance with Cortés, extracting heavy legal promises that in exchange for their continuous military aid, Tlaxcala would be granted total, permanent exemption from any future Spanish royal taxes, absolute possession of the conquered city of Cholula, and a massive share of all subsequent Aztec imperial spoils. With his secure political base re-established, Cortés began constructing a brilliant, unprecedented, and highly complex counteroffensive strategy designed to launch a methodical, total siege against the waterlocked fortress of Tenochtitlan. He understood with absolute clarity that he could never hope to conquer the city through a simple, frontal land assault across the narrow stone causeways, as the Aztecs could easily destroy the wooden bridges and use their massive naval armada of thousands of war canoes to systematically slaughter his men from the water. To solve this monumental tactical problem, Cortés turned to his master shipwright, a brilliant, highly resourceful engineer named Martin Lopez. Cortés formulated a breathtaking, near-mythical engineering plan. He ordered his men, accompanied by thousands of Tlaxcalan laborers, to ascend high into the dense pine forests of the surrounding mountains to fell thousands of massive trees. There, far from the waters of the lake, they methodically crafted, cut, and assembled 13 massive, highly maneuverable, and heavily armed wooden sailing ships known as brigantines. These ships were specifically designed with shallow drafts to navigate the tricky waters of Lake Texcoco and featured heavy wooden decks capable of carrying iron cannons and withstand indigenous missile fire. Once these 13 massive vessels were fully constructed and rigorously tested on the mountain rivers, Lopez ordered them completely dismantled into thousands of individual numbered planks, iron bolts, and heavy canvas sails. In an incredible, mind-boggling logistical feat, a massive, miles-long column of over 10,000 Tlaxcalan porters carried these heavy ship pieces completely on their bare backs down through the treacherous mountain passes, transporting them over 50 miles into the Valley of Mexico, where they were systematically reassembled in a specially constructed deep canal, ready to be launched as the ultimate, devastating naval weapon to block and control the lake. However, while the Spaniards were busy forging their iron weapons and assembling their wooden fleet, an infinitely more devastating, invisible, and terrifying ally had already slipped silently into the Valley of Mexico ahead of them, launching a horrific, apocalyptic assault against the indigenous populations that would completely alter the demographic history of the global world. Sometime during the early summer of 1520, a single African slave belonging to the incoming punitive army of Panfilo de Narvaez had made landfall on the coast while actively carrying the active, highly contagious pathogen of the variola major virus, the dreaded, catastrophic disease of smallpox. Because the indigenous populations of the Americas had lived in absolute, total geographical isolation from the Old World for tens of thousands of years, they possessed absolutely zero genetic immunity, zero protective antibodies, and zero historical experience dealing with this highly lethal airborne virus. The result was a sudden, continent-spanning demographic explosion of raw physical horror that modern historians refer to as the First Great Pandemic. The silent scourge ripped through the dense, highly integrated urban centers of the Valley of Mexico with a terrifying, apocalyptic speed that completely paralyzed society. Within weeks, the beautiful palaces and clean streets of Tenochtitlan were transformed into a vast, open-air necropolis. The disease manifested with terrifying physical violence. Victims were rapidly covered from head to toe in massive, agonizingly painful, and burning pustules that literally liquefying their skin, leaving them completely incapable of moving, rolling over, or even lifting a cup of clean water to their parched lips. Because the virus struck down entire households, extended families, and entire neighborhoods simultaneously, there was absolutely no one left healthy enough to tend the agricultural crops, fetch fresh water from the aqueducts, or bury the dead. Thousands of people died, not just from the direct viral infection, but from simple, agonizing starvation and dehydration inside their own homes. The air of the valley became thick, heavy, and toxic with the suffocating stench of thousands of rotting bodies that lay unburied in the dark rooms, as the surviving citizens were too weak to carry them away. The smallpox pandemic was absolutely indiscriminate in its socio-legal devastation, systematically striking down the absolute cream of the Mexica political, religious, and military leadership at the exact moment they needed stability most. In the late autumn of 1520, after a brief, highly energetic reign of a mere 80 days, the heroic Emperor Cuitlahuac, the brilliant military mastermind who had successfully orchestrated the total expulsion of the Spaniards during La Noche Trista, succumbed directly to the agonizing ravages of the virus, leaving his throne vacant and his people leaderless in the face of an imminent invasion. Along with the emperor, thousands of veteran military captains, highly experienced high priests, master builders, and local administrative officials died in the dirt, completely dismantling the complex, fragile bureaucratic machinery of the Aztec state. When Hernán Cortés finally stood at the edge of the mountains in early 1521, ready to descend into the valley with his reassembled fleet and his massive army of over 80,000 indigenous allies, he was no longer facing a proud, unified, and highly confident global empire. He was preparing to launch a total war against a deeply traumatized, physically shattered, and biologically broken civilization that was actively bleeding to death from the inside out. By the bright, warm spring of 1521, the stage was officially set for the final, catastrophic act in the bitter struggle for the Valley of Mexico. Hernán Cortés had completely reconstructed his shattered forces, turning his strategic base at Texcoco into a massive, heavily fortified imperial shipyard. His master engineer, Martin Lopez, had successfully reassembled the 13 custom-built wooden brigantines, their hulls caulked with animal fat, their tall masts rigged with heavy canvas, and their decks armed with the remaining iron cannons salvaged from the coastal expeditions. Outside the shipyard stood an imposing, unprecedented military host. Nearly 1,000 Spanish infantrymen, 80 elite cavalry warhorses, and an absolutely staggering, sea-like wave of over 100,000 fiercely disciplined Tlaxcalan and native allies who had converged upon the valley to witness the absolute destruction of their ancient Aztec oppressors. Arrayed against them inside the disease-shattered capital of Tenochtitlan was the newly elevated 18-year-old Emperor Cuauhtémoc, a fierce, uncompromising young warrior whose name translated poetically and terrifyingly to the Descending Eagle. Cuauhtémoc possessed zero interest in the weak diplomatic appeasements of his predecessor Moctezuma. He was deeply determined to defend his civilization, his gods, and his capital to the absolute, blood-soaked end of human endurance. On the fateful morning of May 22nd, 1521, Cortés gave the historic command to formally tighten the iron noose around the waterlocked metropolis, launching a total, methodical siege designed to completely starve Tenochtitlan into absolute submission. He divided his massive ground forces into 3 large, independent army corps, assigning them to block the 3 massive stone causeways that linked the island city to the mainland. The brutal captain Pedro de Alvarado commanded the northern assault from Tlacopan. Gonzalo de Sandoval led the eastern push along the causeway of Iztapalapa, and Cristobal de Olid assumed command of the southern causeway at Coyoacán. However, before the ground troops could advance a single step along these narrow, exposed stone paths, Cortés executed the first, highly calculated move of his total warfare strategy. He personally led a heavily armed detachment to the mainland hill of Chapultepec and systematically, violently smashed the great twin stone aqueducts that had supplied the hundreds of thousands of citizens inside Tenochtitlan with clean, fresh drinking water for generations. Within a single afternoon, the primary lifeblood of the city was completely cut off, forcing the population to rely exclusively on brackish, highly contaminated, and salty water drawn directly from the lake, which rapidly triggered an internal wave of devastating gastrointestinal diseases and acute dehydration among the children and the elderly. Simultaneously, the 13 wooden brigantines unfurled their massive white sails, catching the strong winds of the valley to launch the first true, large-scale naval offensive in the history of the American continent. As the heavy ships glided majestic into the open water, the Aztec military responded with astonishing speed and bravery, launching a massive, terrifying swarm of over 4,000 specialized war canoes that completely blackened the surface of Lake Texcoco. The native warriors rowed hard, screaming their terrifying war whistles, attempting to surround and violently board the Spanish vessels through sheer, overwhelming numerical force. For a brief, tense moment, the wind suddenly died down, leaving the large wooden ships temporarily stranded and motionless in the calm water, surrounded by the advancing indigenous swarm. Cortés's men held their breath, clutching their crossbows and iron pikes in absolute silence as the canoes drew closer. Suddenly, a powerful, providential northern breeze ripped through the valley, slamming into the heavy canvas sails. The brigantines leaped forward with immense kinetic energy, their heavy, iron-reinforced wooden prows crashing directly into the fragile cedar canoes, systematically smashing them into splinters and overturning them into the deep water. The Spanish sailors loaded their heavy cannons with scrap iron and stones, unleashing a continuous, deafening roar of close-range broadsides that tore massive, bloody lanes through the packed native fleet. The lake was rapidly transformed into a horrific, churning cauldron of blood, broken paddles, and drowning warriors, establishing absolute, unyielding Spanish naval supremacy over the water within a single morning. With the lake completely cleared of opposition, the 13 brigantines transformed into highly mobile, floating artillery platforms that could move swiftly along the flanks of the narrow stone causeways, providing devastating, close-range tactical fire support for the advancing ground columns of Alvarado, Sandoval, and Alid. The battle for the causeways quickly degenerated into a slow, grinding, and incredibly bloody war of inches. Every single morning at dawn, the Spanish infantrymen and their thousands of Tlaxcalan allies would charge forward along the narrow paths, only to find that the brilliant Aztec engineers had systematically cut deep, wide gaps into the stone structures, erecting massive defensive breastworks made of heavy timber and stone to block their advance. Behind these walls stood dense, highly organized formations of Mexica warriors who fought with an absolute, suicidal ferocity that repeatedly stunned the veteran conquistadors. They used long, specialized anti-cavalry pikes tipped with captured Spanish steel swords to impale the charging horses, rain down an endless, deafening black cloud of obsidian arrows from the water, and engaged in brutal, hand-to-hand combat where their primary, terrifying objective was not to kill the Spaniards on the field, but to violently drag them alive into the water to be taken back to the high sacrificial altars. Every evening, as the exhausting shadows grew long over the valley, the Spaniards were forced to retreat back along the causeways to their secure mainland encampments, as it was completely impossible to defend their exposed positions in the dark. The moment the white soldiers stepped backward, thousands of hidden Aztec warriors would pour out of the city canals to instantly, methodically dig out the exact same water gaps the Spaniards had spent the entire day filling with earth and stone. This agonizing, repetitive cycle of violence repeated day after day, week after week, exhausting the physical strength and unraveling the psychological sanity of the invaders. Cortés rapidly realized that his traditional European rules of siege warfare were completely ineffective against a society that viewed total military destruction as a holy, spiritual obligation to their cosmic deities. The true, unmitigated horror of the siege reached a deeply traumatizing peak for the Spaniards in late June, when a highly coordinated, aggressive Aztec counteroffensive successfully managed to isolate a forward column led personally by Cortés along the southern causeway. In the chaotic, muddy melee that followed, dozens of Spanish soldiers were suddenly surrounded, violently disarmed, and dragged screaming into the deep black water by teams of elite eagle and jaguar warriors. Cortés himself was violently tackled to the ground by 4 large native captains who attempted to drag him toward a waiting canoe. He was only saved from a horrific fate by the desperate, suicidal intervention of his loyal page, Cristobal de Olea, who killed 2 of the attackers before being hacked to pieces in the mud. While Cortés managed to limp back to safety, over 60 Spanish conquistadors were successfully captured alive by the triumphant Mexica forces. As the sun began to set over the valley, casting a deep, bloody crimson glow across the waters. The entire Spanish army stood frozen in absolute, paralyzed horror on the mainland shores as the great snakeskin war drum of the Templo Mayor began to thunder through the quiet air. From miles away, the soldiers could look clearly through their brass spyglasses at the high, open platforms of the Great Pyramid. In a highly orchestrated, terrifying public theater of death, the Aztec priests forced the naked, pale Spanish captives to walk up the steep stone steps in a single-file line, decorating their heads with exotic feathers and forcing them to dance before the great statue of Huitzilopochtli. One by one, the fully conscious Spanish soldiers were thrown backward onto the cold, curved sacrificial stones. The high priest plunged an obsidian knife directly into their chests, tearing open their rib cages to rip out their still-beating hearts, holding the steaming flesh high toward the setting sun before unceremoniously kicking the headless, bleeding corpses down the long stone steps, where they were systematically dismembered by the cheering crowd below. For days, the terrifying echo of those distant, familiar screams drifted across the silent water, plunging the surviving conquistadors into a profound, suffocating state of deep psychological trauma and absolute dread. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the conquistadors by the horrific public sacrifice of their captured comrades on the high altars of the Templo Mayor had initially threatened to completely fracture the fragile morale of the entire Spanish-led coalition. For several tense, agonizing days, Hernán Cortés was forced to temporarily halt any major direct frontal assaults along the blood-stained stone causeways, choosing instead to maintain an ironclad, unyielding naval and land blockade that systematically strangled the remaining life out of the island fortress. Inside the beautiful but broken metropolis of Tenochtitlan, the structural reality of absolute starvation and unmitigated biological ruin was now achieving what European weapons alone could never completely accomplish. The hundreds of thousands of civilian citizens and remaining warriors trapped within the tight perimeter of the city had completely exhausted their emergency food reserves. Every single scrap of traditional provisions was entirely gone. The markets that had once overflowed with vibrant agricultural wealth were now empty, silent expanses of dust and despair. To survive the crushing, agonizing pangs of hunger, the proud Mexica people were forced by absolute necessity to descend into a state of sheer, raw material desperation. They systematically scoured the drying mud of the lake beds for tiny, brackish insects, boiled the bitter bark and small leaves of the ancient ornamental trees, dug deep into the hard earth to chew on raw roots, and eagerly consumed the thin thatch pulled directly from the roofs of their own collapsing homes. The contaminated, intensely salty water drawn from the shallow edges of the lake, the only fluid available since Cortés had shattered the great twin stone aqueducts of Chapultepec, triggered an internal wave of devastating dysentery and catastrophic dehydration that systematically targeted the most vulnerable segments of the population, leaving the dark rooms of the city filled with the quiet, weak crying of dying children and the helpless groans of the elderly. Yet, despite this apocalyptic accumulation of physical agony, the young Emperor Cuauhtémoc fiercely, stubbornly refused to entertain even a single whisper of diplomatic surrender or political submission. He decreed with absolute, unwavering martial authority that any citizen caught actively advocating for peace or proposing negotiations with the white foreign parasites would be immediately declared a traitor to the state, dragged to the central plazas, and executed on the spot as a sacred sacrifice to the gods of war. Recognizing that the traditional European methodology of siege warfare, which relied upon capturing strategic urban checkpoints and expecting a rational political capitulation, was completely ineffective against a civilization that viewed total destruction as a holy cosmic duty, Hernán Cortés made a monumental, terrifyingly ruthless shift in his military strategy. He understood that as long as the dense, tightly packed labyrinth of multi-story stone palaces, complex Chinampa agricultural plots, and narrow, deep urban canals remained intact, the highly disciplined Aztec warriors could utilize them as a flawless, highly defensive guerrilla warfare network, launching devastating ambush attacks from the flat roofs and hidden alleys every time the Spaniards attempted to advance into the interior. Therefore, Cortés resolved to execute a horrific strategy of systematic, total urban annihilation. He officially ordered his ground forces, accompanied by the massive, multi-thousand wave of their Tlaxcalan and native allies, to advance into the city not to capture property, but to systematically destroy every single physical structure in their path. Every single morning at the break of dawn, the combined Spanish and Tlaxcalan units would push forward into the outer residential quarters of the city under the heavy, protective cover of the broadsides fired from the 13 wooden brigantines. As they entered each neighborhood, specialized squads of indigenous laborers equipped with heavy bronze axes, iron crowbars, and massive ropes would systematically tear down the beautiful, whitewashed stone villas, smash the delicate gardens, and collapse the magnificent palaces of the Aztec nobility into massive piles of rubble. This endless sea of shattered stone, broken timber, and loose earth was then methodically carted forward and dumped directly into the deep urban canals that formed the aquatic streets of the city, permanently filling them in and packing them down to create wide, open, and completely flat earthen highways. This brutal, mechanical process completely eliminated the tactical advantages of the Aztec defense. It stripped them of their hidden sniper positions on the roofs, cleared wide, unobstructed paths for the terrifying, high-speed charges of the heavy Spanish cavalry warhorses, and provided a clear, open line of sight for the devastating deployments of the iron artillery cannons. The implementation of this total destruction strategy transformed the war into a slow, grinding, and incredibly gruesome process that unfolded over consecutive weeks of unmitigated horror. The Aztecs contested every single house, every single room, and every single filled canal with a desperate, suicidal valor that repeatedly moved the hardened conquistadors to expressions of profound, dark admiration. When the Mexico warriors ran out of obsidian-tipped arrows and copper-tipped javelins, they crawled through the rubble to hurl broken pieces of stone and handfuls of dirt at the advancing infantrymen with their bare, bleeding hands. The traditional lines between official military combatants and the civilian population completely dissolved in the smoke of the burning quarters. In the deep, final weeks of July, as the Spanish columns pushed deeper into the remaining northern districts of Tlatelolco, Aztec women actively stepped onto the rubble-strewn battlefields alongside their surviving husbands and sons. They wore the heavy, quilted cotton war armor of their fallen brothers, brandished shattered wooden broadswords with terrifying fury, and launched themselves directly onto the steel pikes of the conquistadors, preferring to be brutally hacked to pieces on the open field rather than suffer the humiliation of Spanish colonial slavery. As the physical perimeter of the Aztec defense shrunk further and further into the northernmost corner of the island, the remaining territory became a claustrophobic, unimaginably congested hellscape of human misery and death. Over 100,000 people were now tightly compressed into a tiny, suffocating pocket of land that was completely incapable of supporting them. Because the filled canals and massive piles of stone rubble completely blocked the natural drainage of the island, the streets rapidly became stagnant, muddy swamps thick with filth and human waste. The air of the entire valley of Mexico became so heavy, toxic, and suffocatingly foul with the intense, unrelenting stench of thousands of decomposing human bodies that the conquistadors and their Tlaxcalan allies were forced to tie thick rags soaked in vinegar over their noses just to prevent themselves from continuously vomiting on the field. The dead bodies lay piled in massive, gruesome rows along the edges of the flat dirt highways. They filled the dark interior rooms of the collapsing villas to the absolute ceiling, and they floated in bloated, pale masses along the remaining edges of the lake, as the surviving citizens were far too weak, emaciated, and physically broken by the advanced ravages of smallpox and starvation to perform the basic sacred burial rites for their loved ones. Hernán Cortés, looking out over this vast, smoldering expanse of raw human ruin from his high command post on a captured pyramid platform, made one final attempt to bring a peaceful diplomatic end to the slaughter. He sent a captured Aztec noble back across the lines to the Emperor Cuauhtémoc, carrying a message of deep respect for his incredible bravery, offering a full, guaranteed royal pardon, and promising that the city would be spared any further physical destruction if the emperor would simply agree to sit down for peaceful terms of capitulation under the authority of the Spanish crown. Cuauhtémoc convened a final, desperate emergency council with his surviving high priests, veteran military captains, and clan elders beneath the shadow of their remaining shattered temples. The high priests spoke with absolute, uncompromising spiritual fervor, reminding the young ruler of the ancient prophecies of their ancestors, warning him that the white foreign intruders would inevitably bring a total, permanent disruption to their entire cosmic order, and declaring that it was vastly better to die a glorious, honorable death on the field of battle alongside their gods than to live as broken, humiliated slaves under the cross of the white men. Cuauhtémoc listened intently to their words, raised his golden scepter high, and decisively issued his final imperial decree. The Mexico would never surrender. They would continue to fight until the very last warrior was dead, and the very last drop of Aztec blood was spilled into the waters of the lake. The decisive rejection of Hernán Cortés's final diplomatic peace offering by the Emperor Cuauhtémoc formally sealed the absolute apocalyptic fate of the remaining population of Tenochtitlan. By the opening days of August 1521, the once monumental, glorious Triple Alliance Empire had been brutally, methodically compressed into a single, waterlogged, and blood-soaked marketplace district in the northern twin city of Tlatelolco. This final pocket of indigenous resistance was a claustrophobic, unimaginably congested hellscape of human suffering, where over 100,000 emaciated survivors, warriors, women, children, and high priests, were tightly packed together beneath a toxic, leaden sky. They were completely surrounded by an unyielding iron ring of Spanish steel infantry, roaring artillery cannons, and an absolutely immense, sea-like wave of over 100,000 Tlaxcalan and native allies who were driven by a centuries-old, consuming hatred for their former Mexica oppressors. The physical geography of the great island metropolis had been completely destroyed. The magnificent whitewashed palaces and towering stone temples were now nothing but massive, smoldering mountains of gray rubble, which the Spaniards had systematically used to permanently fill in the deep urban canals, turning the Venice of the New World into a flat, dusty earthen highway optimized for the devastating, high-speed cavalry charges of the heavy European war horses. As the gunpowder supplies of the conquistadors began to run dangerously low due to weeks of continuous, close-range bombardment, Hernán Cortés approved a highly unusual, bizarre engineering project proposed by a self-proclaimed military inventor among his infantrymen named Francisco de Solis. Solis confidently asserted to the high command that he possessed the advanced mechanical knowledge necessary to construct a massive, ancient Roman-style wooden trebuchet or catapult atop the high stone platform of a captured theater pyramid in Tlatelolco. This immense siege engine was intended to systematically hurl massive, 100-pound boulders directly into the center of the remaining Aztec quarters, crushing their fragile timber huts and forcing an immediate tactical surrender without wasting precious Spanish gunpowder or crossbow bolts. For several consecutive days, Hundreds of Tlaxcalan laborers were forced to cart heavy timber, thick ropes, and iron bolts to assemble this lumbering wooden monster under Solis's eccentric directions. When the immense catapult was finally completed, a massive crowd of conquistadors and native allies gathered in the plaza to witness its historic launch. The massive wooden arm was cranked down with immense tension. A huge limestone boulder was placed in the leather sling, and the triggering mechanism was released with a deafening, violent snap. However, due to Solis's profound mathematical incompetence and complete ignorance of structural engineering, the massive boulder did not launch forward into the enemy lines. Instead, it flew straight up into the air, reaching a terrifying height before plunging directly backward onto the wooden siege engine itself, completely smashing the catapult, the platform, and several unfortunate Spanish observers into splinters in a single moment of absolute, embarrassing farce. While this brief mechanical failure provided a momentary, grim distraction, it did absolutely nothing to delay the relentless, slow-moving machine of total urban destruction. The young Emperor Cuauhtémoc, recognizing that his remaining warriors were too physically emaciated, weak, and broken by the advanced ravages of smallpox and acute starvation to wield their heavy obsidian-tipped broadswords effectively, made the radical tactical decision to deploy his final, elite military asset, the sacred costume of the Owl of Quetzalcoatl. This was a terrifying, deeply revered imperial warsuit consisting of a massive wooden frame covered in iridescent green feathers, a jagged helmet shaped like a monstrous bird of prey, and a sacred steel-pointed javelin that had been personally captured from a Spanish captain during the bloody retreat of La Noche Triste. Under ancient Mexica religious law, this terrifying costume was considered a literal cosmic weapon of mass destruction, a divine manifestation of the war god that could only be brought onto the battlefield as an absolute, final resort when the state faced imminent cosmic extinction. The legendary, undefeated warrior captain named Tlaxcala was carefully arrayed in this sacred feathered armor, instructed to climb to the absolute highest point of a surviving temple platform, and ordered to leap directly into the midst of the advancing Spanish ranks, with the high priest confidently promising that his divine bird-like charge would trigger a sudden, apocalyptic earthquake that would swallow the white men whole into the lake. Tlaxcala leaped into the melee with astonishing, terrifying ferocity, his brilliant feathers swirling through the dark smoke as he swung his heavy broadsword with a raw kinetic energy born of pure spiritual desperation, momentarily scattering the forward Spanish infantrymen and killing several native porters. However, the cold-blooded, pragmatic conquistadors operating the iron artillery units were completely immune to the psychological terror of Mesoamerican spiritual iconography. Instead of fleeing in superstitious panic, a sharp-eyed Spanish cannoneer calmly adjusted the iron sights of his heavy bronze artillery piece, loaded a massive iron grapeshot canister, and fired a devastating, deafening broadside directly at the feathered war captain. The explosive blast of iron and lead tore through the sacred costume, violently obliterating the Owl of Quetzalcoatl, and blowing the captain's body into bloody fragments that rained down across the stone steps of the temple. The sudden, unceremonious destruction of their ultimate cosmic weapon shattered the final, fragile remnants of psychological hope among the surviving Aztec warriors, plunging the remaining defenders into a state of profound, absolute despair as they realized their great gods had completely abandoned them to the edge of European steel. The final Spanish-led breakthrough into the heart of the Tlatelolco marketplace unleashed a terrifying, unmitigated deluge of raw human slaughter that modern historians consider one of the most brutal, gruesome instances of total civilian genocide in recorded human history. Hernán Cortés completely lost any semblance of operational command or military control over his massive host of over 100,000 Tlaxcalan, Totonac, and Chalca allies. For nearly 800 years, the Mexica had treated these surrounding kingdoms with an absolute, crushing tyranny, systematically destroying their towns, imposing exorbitant economic taxes, and violently dragging tens of thousands of their young sons and daughters to the high altars of Tenochtitlan to have their hearts ripped out by obsidian knives. Now, with the iron walls of Aztec military power completely smashed to ash, an immense, unstoppable wave of deep, multi-generational native vengeance was unleashed upon the defenseless population. The Tlaxcalan warriors rushed through the narrow, muddy alleys of the marketplace like starving wolves, completely deaf to the desperate screams of women or the quiet crying of children. They systematically blocked every single exit, drawn their copper-tipped knives, and commenced a cold-blooded, systematic slaughter of unparalleled scale. They broke into the dark, collapsing huts to brutally butcher the emaciated victims who were far too weak from smallpox to even lift their hands. They cornered groups of elderly priests and hacked them to pieces beneath their own defiled idols. And they systematically slaughtered thousands of pregnant women and infants to ensure that the royal Mexica bloodline would be permanently erased from the face of the earth. The mud of the Tlatelolco marketplace rapidly transformed into a deep, flowing river of crimson blood that emptied directly into the lake, turning the turquoise waters a dark, thick purple. Even the hardened, battle-tested conquistadors from Extremadura, men who had participated in the bloody wars of Italy and the brutal frontier raids of the Caribbean, stood frozen in absolute, paralyzed horror at the sheer, unrestrained ferocity of the native slaughter, noting in their personal diaries that the air of the city was filled with a sound so terrifyingly high and consistent with human agony that it would haunt their dreams for the rest of their natural lives. Cortés desperately ordered his buglers to blow the formal signal for a total military retreat, attempting to clear the plazas and preserve a small segment of the population to act as taxable royal subjects for the Spanish crown. But his commands were completely ignored by the roaring, blood-mad Tlaxcalan columns who continued to hunt, loot, and slaughter until the entire remaining district of Tlatelolco was transformed into a silent, smoking mountain of human flesh and ash. The absolute, apocalyptic climax of the 93-day siege of Tenochtitlan was achieved on the stormy, rain-drenched afternoon of August 13th, 1521, a date that would forever remain etched in global history as the brutal death knell of Mesoamerican civilization. The final defensive perimeter of Tlatelolco had completely dissolved into a smoking, blood-slick mountain of gray stone rubble and decomposing human bodies. Recognizing that any further physical resistance was not only strategically impossible but mathematically absurd, the young Emperor Cuauhtémoc executed his final, deeply tragic imperial move. He slipped through the thick, suffocating blanket of black gunpowder smoke that hung low over the lake, stepping into a small, swift royal cedar dugout canoe accompanied by his beautiful young wife, several high-ranking noble family members, and a small, fiercely loyal elite guard of veteran Jaguar captains. Their desperate, immediate objective was to break through the tightly maintained Spanish naval blockade in the dark rain, escape into the mainland hills of Texcoco, and attempt to organize a long-term guerrilla warfare campaign in the distant mountains to preserve the fragile survival of the Mexica identity. However, the cold-blooded, pragmatic mechanism of Spanish naval supremacy was operating with a near-mechanical efficiency that left absolutely zero room for imperial escape. Cruising slowly through the murky, blood-stained waters of the northern sector was the heavily armed Spanish brigantine commanded by Captain Garcia Holguin. As the clearing rain momentarily lifted the heavy fog, Holguin's sharp-eyed lookouts caught sight of the royal canoe, its fine wood and unique construction immediately betraying the immense socio-political status of its occupants. Holguin instantly ordered his helmsman to turn the massive wooden warship, unfurling its sails to actively ram the fragile cedar canoe, while his Spanish crossbowmen and iron musketeers loaded their weapons, aiming them directly at the uncovered heads of the native rowers. Recognizing the absolute, terrifying disparity of force, and wanting to desperately protect the lives of his young wife and family from a sudden, violent volley of iron lead, Cuauhtémoc proudly, resolutely stood up in the rocking canoe, raised his hands toward the towering European vessel, and shouted across the water in a loud, commanding voice, "I am Cuauhtémoc, Emperor of Tenochtitlan. Do not fire upon my family. I demand to be taken directly to your commander, Cortés!" Garcia Holguin, fully recognizing the staggering historical magnitude of his capture, treated the fallen emperor with a calculated, superficial display of high Spanish chivalry, helping him ascend the heavy wooden steps of the brigantine and escorting him immediately to the mainland terrace of Azcapotzalco, where Hernán Cortés had established his central operational headquarters. Cortés had hastily prepared a dramatic public stage for this historic encounter, draping the stone walls with rich red velvet carpets and arranging fine, carved wooden chairs for his high-ranking captains, with the brilliant Doña Marina standing closely at his right hand to act as the essential linguistic bridge for the final surrender. When the emaciated, yet fiercely unbroken young emperor stepped onto the terrace, clothed in a torn cotton robe that was heavily stained with the mud and blood of his dying city, the entire gathering of conquistadors fell into a tense, absolute silence. Cuauhtémoc walked directly up to the Spanish commander, looked him squarely in the eyes with an unyielding dignity that deeply moved the hardened soldiers, and spoke these legendary, heart-wrenching words through the translation of Malinche. I have done everything within my human power, and everything that my gods required of me, to defend my city, my people, and my ancestors from your violence. But my force is completely spent. I am now brought before you as a helpless captive. Take that dagger which you wear at your waist and plunge it directly into my heart, so that you may release my spirit to join my ancestors and my gods who died in the ruins of my empire." Hernán Cortés, displaying his masterful, sophisticated grasp of political theater and human psychology, chose not to execute the emperor on the spot. He understood with perfect, cold-blooded clarity that a living, compliant puppet monarch was infinitely more valuable for his future colonial administrative plans than a dead indigenous martyr. Cortés stepped forward, embraced Cuauhtémoc with a show of deep respect, wrapped his own fine silk cloak around the emperor's trembling shoulders, and solemnly promised that his life, his family, and his remaining subjects would be placed under the immediate, protective legal custody of the Spanish crown. With the formal capture of the emperor, the continuous, deafening roar of iron cannons, and the piercing screams of war whistles that had violently shattered the peace of the valley for 3 consecutive months suddenly, completely ceased. A profound, eerily silent, and suffocating stillness descended over the smoking ruins of Tenochtitlan. The surviving, emaciated citizens, looking like pale, walking ghosts covered in the horrific physical scars of smallpox and acute starvation, slowly crept out of their dark, ruined cellars, dragged their weak legs across the earthen highways that had once been beautiful turquoise canals, and began a massive, silent exodus out of the dead city, leaving the ancestral home of the Aztecs to the absolute possession of the white men. However, the fragile illusion of Spanish chivalry and respect was destined to rapidly, violently dissolve under the absolute, unrelenting pressure of raw material greed. The common Spanish infantrymen, who had spent months risking their lives on the blood-soaked causeways, suffering from horrific tropical diseases, and watching their closest comrades get brutally sacrificed on the high altars, were driven by a singular, consuming expectation. They believed they were going to divide an immense, near-limitless mountain of Aztec gold, silver, and precious jade that would instantly transform every single one of them into wealthy, independent aristocrats for the rest of their lives. Yet, when Cortés's royal treasurers officially gathered all the gold trinkets, hammered ornaments, and jewelry that had been salvaged from the smoldering ruins or stripped from the bodies of the dead, the total value amounted to a mere 130,000 gold castellanos. After systematically deducting the grand 20% for the royal fifth of King Charles V, and setting aside massive shares to repay the private Italian bankers, civilian merchants, and Cortés himself for the initial financial cost of the ships, horses, and weapons. The remaining portion left for the common soldiers was laughably, insultingly small, amounting to less than 80 pesos per infantryman, an amount that was barely sufficient to purchase a new pair of leather boots or replace a shattered iron sword. A dangerous, explosive wave of bitter resentment, mutiny, and paranoid conspiracy rapidly ripped through the Spanish encampment. The furious soldiers openly wrote insulting, mocking graffiti on the white walls of Cortés's private villa, aggressively accusing their brilliant general of secretly stealing the vast majority of the Aztec imperial treasure for himself, concealing it within hidden subterranean vaults beneath his own palace, or dumping it into the deep mud of the lake during the chaotic retreat of La Noche Triste. To protect his fragile political authority and appease the boiling fury of his armed underclass, Cortés was forced to abandon his legal promises of humane treatment, turning the captive Emperor Cuauhtémoc and his high-ranking noble captains over to the cold, brutal custody of his royal treasurers, who were authorized to utilize any level of physical violence necessary to extract the secret locations of the legendary lost Aztec gold. The royal torturers bound the young emperor and the king of Tlaxcala to heavy stone benches, systematically coated the bare soles of their feet with highly flammable oil, and held glowing, red-hot iron coals directly against their skin for hours. As the intense heat scorched through the flesh, leaving their feet permanently deformed and ruined, the king of Tlacopan, pushed far beyond the absolute boundaries of human endurance, turned his eyes toward Cuauhtémoc in deep agony, weeping and begging his emperor for permission to speak and reveal whatever minor secrets he knew to stop the horrific torment. Cuauhtémoc, despite suffering from an unimaginable, near-fatal intensity of physical agony, slowly turned his head, looked upon his weeping captain with a cold, unyielding aristocratic scorn, and uttered his final, immortal rebuke. "And do you think that I am enjoying a bath of roses right now?" Shamed into absolute silence by the emperor's supreme stoicism, the king never spoke another word, and despite consecutive days of horrific physical mutilation, the Spanish torturers failed completely to locate any massive, hidden subterranean mountains of gold, finding only a few minor trinkets that had been discarded in the shallow waters of the lake. The physical reality of the absolute destruction of Tenochtitlan marked the permanent, irreversible erasure of the Mexican political entity from global history. Hernán Cortés, operating with the broad administrative powers granted to him as governor and captain general of New Spain, made the conscious, highly strategic decision not to abandon the dead island fortress. Instead, he resolved to construct his new, grand colonial capital, Mexico City, directly on top of the ruined, filled-in foundations of the ancient Aztec metropolis. The great twin pyramids of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc were systematically, completely dismantled by teams of enslaved indigenous laborers, their massive, sacred stone blocks carted away to form the foundations of the grand Catholic cathedral of the Archdiocese of Mexico and the sprawling, fortress-like national palace for the Spanish viceroys. The ancient, highly sophisticated socio-economic order that had sustained millions of people across Mesoamerica was permanently shattered, replaced by the highly extractive feudal encomienda system, which legally bound entire indigenous villages to private Spanish conquistadors as permanent, forced agricultural and mining laborers. The beautiful, vibrant world of the Triple Alliance was gone forever, swallowed entirely by the iron machinery of European global imperialism, leaving nothing behind but a silent, smoldering memory buried deep beneath the cold stone structures of the newly born Spanish world. The definitive silence that pulled over the Valley of Mexico in the late summer of 1521 did not merely signal the conclusion of a bloody, 93-day military siege. It marked the absolute, violent termination of an entire cosmic epoch and the traumatic birth of a deeply fractured colonial world. The grand, waterlocked metropolis of Tenochtitlan, which had once stood as the spectacular, clean, and highly sophisticated beating heart of the Triple Alliance, governing over 5 million subjects with absolute military dominance, was now nothing but a vast, silent, and smoldering wasteland of gray stone rubble, crushed timber, and decomposing human bone. The pristine turquoise waters of Lake Texcoco, which had for centuries mirrored the majestic whitewashed towers of the Great Pyramids, were now permanently stained a thick, dark purple with the blood of over 100,000 slaughtered citizens. As the surviving Mexica population completed their silent, heart-wrenching exodus out of the ruined quarters, dragging their emaciated, smallpox-scarred bodies into the surrounding hills, Hernán Cortés and his high-ranking conquistador captains stood at the absolute apex of an unprecedented global triumph, prepared to systematically construct a new European empire upon the physical and cultural ash of the Old World. To permanently erase the memory of the ancient indigenous state and establish an absolute, unyielding visual symbol of Spanish royal and Catholic authority, Cortés executed a sweeping, highly strategic urban reconstruction program that unfolded over consecutive years of intense colonial labor. He flatly refused to relocate his administrative headquarters to the mainland, choosing instead to build his new imperial capital, Mexico City, directly on top of the ruined, filled-in foundations of the conquered island fortress. Tens of thousands of enslaved Aztec survivors, many of whom were actively suffering from the advanced physical ravages of famine and Old World diseases, were forced under the whip to perform the crushing, back-breaking labor of dismantling their own sacred ancestral monuments. The monumental twin pyramids of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, which had once towered proudly into the blue sky as the spiritual axis of Mesoamerica, were systematically smashed into basic building blocks. These exact same stones, which had for generations been soaked in the sacrificial blood of indigenous warriors, were carted across the dusty plazas to form the heavy foundations and thick walls of the grand metropolitan cathedral of the Assumption and the sprawling, fortress-like National Palace, which served as the official seat of the Spanish viceroys. The beautiful, delicate network of aquatic canals that had defined the Venice of the New World was permanently filled with rubble and packed down to create wide, open, and rigid cobblestone highways optimized for European carriages and heavy military horses, fundamentally altering the environmental and hydrological reality of the valley forever. Concurrently, the complex, highly integrated socio-economic and political systems of the Mesoamerican world were systematically dismantled, replaced by a highly extractive, deeply oppressive feudal structure known as the encomienda system. Under this royal legal framework, individual Spanish conquistadors, cavalry officers, and colonial bureaucrats were formally granted absolute administrative control over massive tracts of land and hundreds of native villages. The indigenous populations were no longer free citizens of independent city-states. Instead, they were legally transformed into a permanent, highly exploited underclass of forced laborers, bound to their private Spanish masters. They were forced under penalty of horrific physical mutilation or public execution to spend their entire lives working in the dark shafts of the newly discovered silver mines of Zacatecas, clearing dense tropical forests for massive agricultural plantations, and constructing massive stone monasteries for the incoming waves of Franciscan and Dominican friars. This economic extraction was accompanied by a relentless, aggressive spiritual crusade designed to achieve the total, permanent eradication of traditional indigenous religious identities. The ancient, beautifully illustrated historical codices, which contained the deep astronomical knowledge, complex calendars, and rich genealogical histories of the Mexica people, were gathered into massive public bonfires by order of the first Archbishop of Mexico, Juan de Zumarraga, who condemned them as demonic heretical texts, permanently erasing centuries of rich literary and intellectual heritage from the human record. The profound, apocalyptic devastation of the conquest was further exacerbated by a continuous, multi-generational demographic collapse driven by the unstoppable onslaught of Old World biological pathogens. Following the catastrophic smallpox pandemic of 1520, which had effectively broken the military spine of the Aztec defense, successive waves of unfamiliar European diseases, including measles, influenza, typhus, and the terrifying, mysterious hemorrhagic fevers known to the native populations as cocolicillae, ripped through the dense agricultural communities of New Spain with an absolute, terrifying lethality. Because the indigenous peoples lacked any historical immunity or genetic protection against these imported viruses, the mortality rates achieved an apocalyptic scale that completely revolutionized the demographic balance of the American continent. Modern historical demographers estimate that within less than a century following Hernán Cortés' historic landfall at Veracruz, the native population of central Mexico plummeted from an estimated 20 million individuals to less than 1 million, a staggering, near unimaginable 95% reduction in human life that completely paralyzed social structures, disrupted ancestral traditions, and left entire valleys completely abandoned to the wilderness. For the primary, historical architects of this monumental conquest, the immediate aftermath of their global triumph brought a long, bitter harvest of profound political betrayal, intense legal litigation, and psychological ruin. The common Spanish infantrymen, who had survived the horrific slaughterhouse of La Noche Triste and spent months risking their lives on the blood-soaked causeways, found themselves largely excluded from the immense wealth and grand aristocratic titles they had been promised. The vast majority of the looted silver, vast land grants, and enslaved labor forces were systematically monopolized by the high royal court in Madrid and incoming, highly educated bureaucrats from Seville who had never swung a sword on the battlefield. Even Hernán Cortés himself, despite his brilliant tactical genius, monumental territorial acquisitions, and immense personal wealth, rapidly discovered that the Spanish crown viewed his immense popularity, independent military authority, and unpredictable audacity with deep, paranoid suspicion. King Charles V systematically stripped Cortés of his grand political position as governor of New Spain, replacing him with cold, compliant royal administrators, and forcing the legendary conquistador to spend the final, exhausting decades of his life embroiled in endless, deeply frustrating legal trials in Spain, constantly begging the royal court for financial compensation and political recognition, until he died in relative obscurity and deep bitterness near Seville in 1547. The young, unbroken Emperor Cuauhtémoc did not live to witness the deep, long-term institutionalization of this colonial order. After surviving the horrific, agonizing torture of his feet by the royal treasurers, he was forced by Cortés to march along as a high-range political hostage during a disastrous 3-year military expedition through the dense, swampy jungles of Honduras. In February 1525, operating under a sudden, deeply paranoid and completely unproven suspicion that the crippled emperor was secretly plotting a massive pan-indigenous revolution to slaughter the remaining Spaniards in the wilderness, Cortés ordered Cuauhtémoc to be unceremoniously hanged from a massive ceiba tree in the dead of night. As the final, legitimate Aztec monarch gasped his last breath in the damp jungle air, the primary political lineage of the Mexica state was permanently broken, leaving nothing behind but an epic, deeply sorrowful legacy of absolute human resilience and martial valor that would echo through the oral traditions of the surviving native populations for centuries to come. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not an isolated regional conflict. It was a profound, world-altering historical pivot point that permanently connected the eastern and western hemispheres, triggering the immediate, rapid rise of the global Spanish Empire, establishing the dominant structural foundations for modern Latin America, and forever redefining the cultural, biological, and geopolitical destiny of the entire modern world.